January 16th, 1893, Honolulu, Hawaii. Queen Liliuokalani sits in her palace, Iolani Palace, the only royal palace on American soil, and she's about to make a decision that will change everything. Outside, American Marines are marching through the streets, not to protect her, to overthrow her. Within 24 hours, an independent nation that had existed for thousands of years will cease to exist. And the most shocking part? The conspiracy that made it happen was hiding in plain sight. This is the story of how a handful of American businessmen, with the help of the United States government, staged one of the most brazen coups in modern history. A story of greed, racism, and betrayal. A story that America tried to forget. This is how America overthrew the Hawaiian Kingdom. To understand how Hawaii fell, you need to understand what Hawaii was. And I'm not talking about the tourist destination you know today. I'm talking about a sophisticated, internationally recognized kingdom that had embassies around the world, treaties with major powers, and a literacy rate that put the United States to shame. Let's go back to 1778. Captain James Cook arrives in Hawaii, and for the first time, these islands enter the Western world's consciousness. But here's what most people don't know. Hawaii wasn't some primitive society waiting to be discovered. The Hawaiian people had an advanced culture, a complex social system, and had been navigating thousands of miles of open ocean using only the stars for centuries before Europeans figured out how to cross the Atlantic reliably. By the early 1800s, King Kamehameha I had unified the Hawaiian Islands into a single kingdom. This wasn't a tribal confederation. This was a centralized monarchy with a clear line of succession, diplomatic relations, and a growing economy based on sandalwood and later sugar. Fast forward to 1840. King Kamehameha III does something revolutionary. He creates Hawaii's first constitution, not because he was forced to, but because he understood that to survive in a world of Western powers, Hawaii needed to play by Western rules. He established a constitutional monarchy, created a legislature, and guaranteed rights to his people. Think about that for a second. In 1840, Hawaii voluntarily adopted a constitutional government. This was a sophisticated political move by a sophisticated leader who understood the game being played. By the 1850s and 60s, Hawaii was thriving. Honolulu was a cosmopolitan city with newspapers in multiple languages, gas streetlights, and a booming economy. The literacy rate among Native Hawaiians was over 90%, higher than in most American states at the time. Hawaiian was a written language with its own newspapers, books, and official documents. The kingdom had treaties with the United States, Britain, France, Japan, and other nations. When Hawaiian royalty traveled abroad, they were received with full honors because Hawaii was a recognized sovereign nation. But there was a problem brewing, and actually there were three problems: sugar, money, and white supremacy. In the mid-1800s, American businessmen started arriving in Hawaii and they saw opportunity. The land was perfect for growing sugarcane, and sugar was becoming one of the most profitable commodities in the world. These men, guys with names like Dole, Thurston, and Castle, they didn't come to Hawaii to be Hawaiians. They came to get rich. And here's where things get interesting. These American plantation owners had a problem. They wanted to sell their sugar to the United States without paying tariffs. But they couldn't do that because Hawaii was a foreign country. So they started pushing for what they called reciprocity, a treaty that would let them export sugar to the U.S. tax-free. In 1875, they got it. The reciprocity treaty was signed, and suddenly, Hawaiian sugar could flood American markets without tariffs. The sugar industry exploded. Plantations expanded. These American businessmen became incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful, and incredibly entitled. But there was a catch in that treaty, a catch that most Hawaiians didn't see coming. The treaty gave the United States exclusive rights to Pearl Harbor as a naval station. Think about that. The U.S. got a strategic military foothold in the middle of the Pacific, and all it had to do was give preferential treatment to a handful of American businessmen growing sugar in Hawaii. By the 1880s, these sugar barons effectively controlled Hawaii's economy, but they didn't control its government. That was still in the hands of the Hawaiian monarchy, and that was unacceptable to them. See, these men had a worldview that was common among white Americans at the time. They believed that white people, particularly Anglo-Saxons, were naturally superior and destined to rule. The idea that they should be subjects of a native Hawaiian monarch, paying taxes to a brown-skinned queen, was offensive to them. They looked at the Hawaiian Kingdom and saw inefficiency, backwardness, and corruption. Not because it was actually there, but because they couldn't imagine that non-white people could run a government effectively. So they started organizing, quietly at first, meeting in private clubs, coordinating their business interests, and planning for the day when they could take control. That day came in 1887, and it was a dress rehearsal for 1893. King Kalakaua was on the throne in 1887, and he had a problem. He liked living well, he traveled, he threw parties, he built a new palace, and the sugar barons hated him for it. They saw him as wasteful, corrupt, and too independent-minded. But the real issue wasn't his spending. The real issue was that Kalakaua was trying to protect Hawaiian sovereignty and native Hawaiian political power. And that was a threat to the sugar barons' interests. In July 1887, they made their move. A group of white businessmen and settlers formed what they called the Hawaiian League, basically an armed militia. They had weapons, they had organization, and they had a plan. They marched to Iolani Palace with a clear message: sign this new constitution or we'll overthrow you right now. Kalakaua was surrounded. He had no army of his own that could match this force. The police were sympathetic to the League. He was alone, so he signed. This new constitution, which became known as the Bayonet Constitution because it was signed at gunpoint, fundamentally changed Hawaii. It stripped the monarchy of most of its power, giving control to the legislature, which the sugar barons now dominated. But here's the really insidious part. It changed the voting requirements. To vote in Hawaii, you now needed to own property or have a significant income, and you needed to swear an oath to the Constitution in English or Hawaiian. Sounds reasonable, right? Except here's what it meant in practice. Wealthy white foreigners who owned property could vote. Poor native Hawaiians, even those who owned small plots of land, often couldn't meet the property requirements. Asian immigrants, who made up a huge portion of the plantation workforce, couldn't vote at all. In one stroke, they had disenfranchised the majority of native Hawaiians while giving political power to a minority of white property owners. Kalakaua became a figurehead. The sugar barons were now running Hawaii in everything but name. But they still had a problem. Hawaii was still technically an independent kingdom, and that meant their position could always be challenged. They needed Hawaii to become part of the United States. That was the end game. That was always the end game, but Kalakaua wouldn't do it. Even humiliated, even stripped of power, he wouldn't sell out his kingdom. So they waited. In 1891, King Kalakaua died while visiting San Francisco. His sister, Liliuokalani, became queen, and the sugar barons immediately knew they had a problem. Liliuokalani was brilliant, educated, and deeply committed to her people. She had traveled the world, composed music, written books, and understood politics better than most of the men who would try to overthrow her. She wasn't going to be a puppet. She looked at what the Bayonet Constitution had done to her kingdom, and she decided, this has to end. Native Hawaiians needed their rights restored. The monarchy needed its power back. Hawaii needed to be Hawaiian again. In January 1893, she prepared to promulgate a new constitution that would restore voting rights to Native Hawaiians and Asians, reduce the power of white property owners, and return authority to the monarchy. It was a direct threat to everything the sugar barons had built, and they weren't going to let it happen. Hey, quick pause here. If you're finding this story as fascinating and infuriating as I did while researching it, do me a favor and hit that like button. It actually helps more people discover these forgotten chapters of history. And subscribe if you want more deep dives into the stories they don't teach you in school. There's a lot more to this story, and it only gets wilder from here. Alright, back to Hawaii, January 1893. The leaders of the overthrow were a group called the Committee of Safety. And yes, that's what they actually called themselves. The irony would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. The key players were Sanford Dole, a lawyer and judge who would become the first president of the Republic of Hawaii and later its territorial governor. His cousin started the Dole Pineapple Company. Lauren Thurston, a lawyer and sugar plantation owner whose family had been missionaries. He was the architect of the conspiracy, and about a dozen other sugar plantation owners, businessmen, and lawyers, almost all of them American or of American descent. I know these men had been planning this for months, maybe years. They had connections in Washington, they had weapons stockpiled, and they had something crucial, the support of the American minister to Hawaii, John L. Stevens. Stevens was supposed to be a neutral diplomatic representative of the United States, but he was anything but neutral. In his personal letters and reports to Washington, he made his views clear. He believed Hawaii should be annexed by the United States. He thought Native Hawaiians were incapable of self-government, and he was willing to help make it happen. In January 1893, as Queen Liliuokalani prepared her new constitution, the Committee of Safety went to Stevens with a request. If they declared a new government, would he support them with American military force? His answer was yes. Let that sink in. The official representative of the United States government was actively conspiring with American businessmen to overthrow a foreign head of state. On January 16th, Stevens ordered American Marines from the USS Boston, which happened to be conveniently stationed in Honolulu, to come ashore. The official reason? To protect American lives and property. The real reason? Intimidation. The next day, January 17th, the Committee of Safety made their move. Here's how brazen this conspiracy was. The Committee of Safety didn't even control any significant portion of Hawaii. They didn't have the support of the Hawaiian people. They didn't have a legitimate claim to power. What they had was about 162 American Marines with modern weapons standing in downtown Honolulu. On the afternoon of January 17th, 1893, the conspirators gathered at the government building, not the palace. They didn't even control the palace, and simply declared that the Hawaiian monarchy was over. They announced the formation of a provisional government with Sanford Dole as president. Queen Liliuokalani was in the palace when she heard the news. She gathered her advisors. Could they resist? Could they fight? The answer was no. The queen had maybe 500 soldiers, poorly armed, facing American Marines with artillery. More importantly, resistance would mean bloodshed. And Liliuokalani knew that in any armed conflict between Hawaiians and Americans, Hawaiians would lose. So she made a calculated decision. She would yield, not to the conspirators, but to the United States government. She would surrender her authority temporarily under protest, the expectation that the United States would investigate this illegal action and restore her to power. She issued a statement that's heartbreaking to read. I yield to the superior force of the United States of America, whose minister plenipotentiary, His Excellency John L. Stevens, has caused United States troops to be landed at Honolulu and declared that he would support the provisional government. Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps the loss of life, I do this under protest and impelled by said force yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representatives and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. Read between the lines, she's saying this is illegal. Your representative helped overthrow me, and I expect you to fix this. But the fix never came. Within hours of the overthrow, Minister Stevens officially recognized the new provisional government. Within days, the conspirators were sending delegations to Washington to negotiate annexation. But they had a problem. President Benjamin Harrison's term was ending, and Grover Cleveland was about to take office. Cleveland was known to be more skeptical of aggressive foreign policy and territorial expansion. When Cleveland took office in March 1893, he immediately smelled something wrong. He pulled the annexation treaty that Harrison had submitted to the Senate and launched an investigation. He sent former Congressman James Blount to Hawaii to figure out what actually happened. And Blount's report, filed later that year, was damning. Blount concluded that the overthrow was illegal, that Minister Stevens had conspired with the insurgents, that the American military had been used to intimidate the Hawaiian government, that the majority of Hawaiian people opposed the provisional government and wanted their queen back. Cleveland called the overthrow an act of war without congressional authorization. He said the United States had a moral obligation to restore the monarchy. For a brief moment, it looked like justice might prevail. But here's the thing about conspiracies. Once they succeed, they're really hard to undo. President Cleveland tried to restore Liliuokalani. He really did. He sent instructions to Hawaii. The provisional government should step down. The queen should be restored. But Sanford Dole and the provisional government refused. While they knew something Cleveland didn't fully appreciate, they had already won. They controlled Hawaii's government, its economy, its infrastructure. They had weapons, and they knew that Cleveland, for all his moral outrage, wasn't willing to send American troops to forcibly remove a government made up of American citizens, even if that government was illegitimate. So Dole called Cleveland's bluff. He essentially said, "What are you going to do about it?" And Cleveland did nothing. Congress wasn't interested in restoring a monarchy. American public opinion, shaped by racist attitudes about Native people's inability to govern themselves, didn't care about the plight of Hawaiians. The sugar lobby was powerful in Washington. The moment passed. In 1894, the provisional government declared itself the Republic of Hawaii with Dole as president. They wrote a constitution that continued to disenfranchise Native Hawaiians. They held elections that most Hawaiians couldn't vote in. Liliuokalani, meanwhile, became a private citizen in her own kingdom, living in her home, writing music, and hoping for justice that would never come. There was one final act of resistance. In 1895, a group of Hawaiian royalists attempted a counter-rebellion to restore the queen. It failed. Liliuokalani was arrested in her own country and charged with treason. She was imprisoned in a room of her own palace for 8 months. During her imprisonment, she was forced to sign a document formally abdicating her throne. She did it to protect her supporters from further punishment. Think about the symbolism. A queen imprisoned in her own palace, forced to renounce her crown by the same people who claimed to be bringing civilization and democracy to Hawaii. The conspirators had always wanted Hawaii to become part of the United States. That was the end game. But they faced a problem. Annexation required a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and they didn't have the votes. So they waited. And in 1898, opportunity knocked. The United States went to war with Spain, the Spanish-American War. Suddenly, America was fighting in the Pacific, in the Philippines, and Hawaii, with its strategic location and Pearl Harbor, became militarily crucial. Congress passed a joint resolution, which only needed a simple majority to annex Hawaii. It wasn't a treaty, it arguably wasn't legal under international law, but it happened. On August 12, 1898, Hawaii became a territory of the United States. The flag of the Hawaiian Kingdom came down, the stars and stripes went up. And just like that, a nation that had existed for over a century, that had been recognized by every major power on earth, ceased to exist. The conspirators had won completely. So, what happened to the people involved in this conspiracy? Sanford Dole became the first territorial governor of Hawaii. He lived comfortably until 1926, honored as a founder of American Hawaii. Lauren Thurston became a newspaper publisher and continued to shape Hawaiian politics for decades. John L. Stevens, the minister who had helped overthrow a queen, was never punished. He retired and lived off his government pension. The sugar barons became even wealthier. The Big Five companies, American Factors, C. Brewer and Company, Castle and Cook, Alexander and Baldwin, and Theo H. Davies and Co. controlled Hawaii's economy for the next 70 years. And Queen Liliuokalani, she lived until 1917, dying at age 79. She never stopped fighting for her people's rights. She composed music, including Aloha O, which became one of Hawaii's most famous songs. She wrote her memoir. She fought legal battles over crown lands. She testified before Congress about the injustices done to Hawaii, but she never got her kingdom back. The Hawaiian people suffered enormously. Their land was taken through various legal mechanisms. Their language was banned in schools starting in 1896. Their culture was suppressed. They became a minority in their own homeland as waves of immigrant workers were brought in for the plantations. By the mid-20th century, Native Hawaiians were among the poorest, least educated, and most marginalized people in Hawaii. For most of the 20th century, the overthrow was taught in Hawaii, if it was taught at all, as a kind of inevitable progress. Hawaii was backwards, the story went, and American businessmen brought civilization. The queen was stubborn and tried to impose autocratic rule, so she had to be removed. It was a lie, but it was a convenient lie that justified what had happened. But starting in the 1970s, there was a Hawaiian Renaissance. Native Hawaiians began reclaiming their language, their culture, and their history. They started telling the truth about what happened in 1893, and slowly, some recognition came. In 1993, exactly 100 years after the overthrow, President Bill Clinton signed the Apology Resolution. It was a formal acknowledgement by the United States Congress that the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii occurred with the active participation of agents and citizens of the United States, and that the Native Hawaiian people never directly relinquished to the United States their claims to their inherent sovereignty. Read that carefully. Congress admitted it. The United States government admitted that the overthrow was illegal, that American officials conspired to make it happen, and that Hawaiians never gave up their sovereignty. But an apology doesn't give back a kingdom. It doesn't undo 100 years of marginalization. It doesn't restore what was lost. If you're still with me, thank you. This is a long story and it's not an easy one, but it's important. Before we get to the conclusion, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We need to keep telling these stories. The complicated, uncomfortable truths about history that don't make it into most textbooks. Drop a comment and let me know. Did you know about the Hawaiian Kingdom before watching this? What surprised you most? Alright, let's bring this home. You might be wondering, why does this matter now? It happened over 130 years ago. Hawaii is a state. Most Hawaiians alive today were born as American citizens. What's the point of rehashing old wounds? Here's why it matters. First, because truth matters. For decades, generations of people were taught a false history. They were told that Hawaii wanted to be part of America, that the overthrow was justified, that it was all inevitable. Those lies shaped how people understood Hawaii, how they treated Native Hawaiians, and how they justified continuing injustices. Second, because the effects are still visible today. Native Hawaiians still suffer from higher rates of poverty, lower educational attainment, and worse health outcomes than other groups in Hawaii. The land issues created by the overthrow, crown lands seized by the Republic and then transferred to the U.S. government, are still contested. The loss of language and culture created by decades of suppression is still being reversed. Third, because this is part of a pattern. The Hawaiian overthrow wasn't unique. It was part of America's expansion across the Pacific and the Caribbean in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The same attitudes, the same tactics, the same justifications were used in Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and elsewhere. Understanding what happened in Hawaii helps us understand American imperialism more broadly. And fourth, because it raises uncomfortable questions about sovereignty, legitimacy, and justice. If a government is overthrown illegally with foreign support, what obligation does the world have to restore it? If that restoration becomes impossible, what is owed to the people whose nation was stolen? These aren't just historical questions, they're relevant to understanding conflicts and injustices around the world today. So let's return to where we started. Was this a conspiracy? Absolutely. A conspiracy is a secret plan by a group to do something unlawful or harmful. That's exactly what happened in Hawaii. A small group of American businessmen secretly planned to overthrow a legitimate government. They coordinated with the American minister who used his position to support them. They leveraged American military force to intimidate opposition. They lied about having popular support. They moved quickly to consolidate power before anyone could stop them. It was a conspiracy in the most literal sense. But here's what makes it even more insidious. It succeeded so completely that for decades it didn't even look like a conspiracy. It was just history. It was progress. It was destiny. The conspirators won so thoroughly that they got to write the story. But the truth has a way of coming out. Archives get opened. Documents get declassified. New generations ask harder questions. And eventually, we see the conspiracy for what it was. The overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom was one of the most successful conspiracies in modern history precisely because it was hiding in plain sight. It was done openly, with official American support, and then retroactively justified through racist theories about civilization and progress. Queen Liliuokalani knew it was a conspiracy. She said so in her surrender statement. She said so in her memoir. She said so in testimony before Congress. She was right. And now, more than 130 years later, even the United States government admits she was right, but she still doesn't have her kingdom back. The story of Hawaii is a reminder that history isn't a straight line of progress. Sometimes civilizations don't fall because they're weak or backwards. Sometimes they fall because someone more powerful decides to take what they have. The Hawaiian Kingdom was sophisticated, literate, internationally recognized, and diplomatically savvy. It did everything right by Western standards. It had a constitution, a legislature, treaties, and rule of law, and it still got overthrown by a handful of businessmen who wanted to make more money and didn't think brown people should govern white people. That's the truth. It's uncomfortable. It complicates the narrative we tell ourselves about American expansion and the creation of our 50th state. But it's the truth, and the truth matters. The Hawaiian Kingdom fell on January 17th, 1893, not because it had to, but because a conspiracy succeeded. Remember that. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive into one of the most overlooked conspiracies in American history. If this changed how you think about Hawaii, or if you learned something new, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. What do you think? Should there be more done to address the overthrow's legacy? Is an apology enough? Let me know in the comments. I read them all. And remember, history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember, what we choose to forget, and what we choose to do about it.